that if Loretta Lynch has one major thing to achieve on her 20-month stint, that would be to come up with some larger process to deal with what we have in this country, which seems quite obvious, a problem with policing in this country. And what we're seeing in the form of these riots in Baltimore is really just the product of that. This is not to excuse rioting. But this is simply, I mean, when you look at this rioting, and yes, it makes no sense, no rational sense to burn down the CVS that your parents or your grandparents or that your cousin has to go, or your has to go and buy goods for their baby or their medication. Because there's probably in that neighborhood not too many pharmacies, frankly. It makes no rational sense to do that. It makes no rational sense to destroy what little infrastructure remains in that neighborhood. You still have burned out structures from 1968 riots following the assassination of Martin Luther King. It makes no rational sense to do this. But it also makes no rational sense that gravity exists. It just does. There's a physics to this. Because there is a long and documented history of people living in that neighborhood, of kids in particular, being abused by the police. And when you continually abuse people and you leave them without any hope, some percentage of them are going to erupt in violence if there's any opportunity that presents itself to do so. That's not to excuse the behavior. That's not to say that it's, well, I mean, I don't know that it's not to excuse the behavior in a very technical sense. It's not a smart thing to do. It's to explain the behavior. It's not to excuse it from a moral sense, but this isn't about, morality. Yes, it's the case that there are a certain percentage of those people who are just criminal in their mindset. There's also, I would imagine, on a spectrum, kids there who are abused by the cops, a 15 or 16-year-old kid or a 14-year-old kid or a 12-year-old kid, who know that when you see a cop, you run. Because if you stick around, there is no scenario where 2, 3, 4 times out of 10, you won't get smacked around or harassed. Maybe it's 5 or 10 or 7. And the thing is, you go through 10 times. And you're a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old, and all of a sudden the opportunity presents itself that you become empowered? Is it a rational reaction? No. I don't want to be held to some standard about when I'm 12 or 15, 16. And that's growing up in about as idyllic of an environment as you could want. And so this is something, this is, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a typically great piece on this. And this, I should say, this does not directly relate. Well, that's the wrong way of putting it. Those people who weren't out there, when they start rioting, they're not protesting directly, it seems to me, the death of Freddie Gray. They're protesting, they're reacting against the context from which Freddie Gray just happens to be the mile marker that people see. That's just a flag that was raised. The Grays, and that's why when the Grays family comes out and says, we don't want any violence, we don't even want any protesting today on the day of his funeral, they don't listen. Because Freddie Gray is no longer a person, or Freddie Gray is just simply an indicator of a broader problem that they're angry about. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, in a piece entitled Nonviolence as Compliance, and he wrote this perhaps yesterday evening. I don't know that, he references the rioting that broke out yesterday. And he described it as a fire, as a forest fire. When nonviolence is preached as an attempt to evade the repercussions of political brutality, it betrays itself. He's responding to the idea of everybody poo-pooing this and how irrational it is, and how they're not doing themselves any favors by rioting, and how it's despicable. This is the point. And I find myself in this situation too when it's a conversation about the Israeli occupation of Palestinians. When you start to get caught up in the morality, you've got a real problem there. Because I can't judge, and there's no way, the morality of every individual on that street, whether they're throwing a brick at the cops or whether they're a cop in a riot gear helmet. There's no way any of us have a sense of what the morality is of each one of those individuals. And of each one of those individuals in every context in which they live. And there's no way their morality is all identical. So when you start talking about the morality of rioting, you've got a real problem because you're not seeing what is actually going on. You're getting caught up in something that has nothing to do with this. And even when you talk about the morality of cops who jump out of their car every time they see a teenage kid and they say, let's just harass these kids. That way they know who's boss. Right? Because that's the story of what happened to Freddie Gray. The cops just rolled up on him for no reason. He ran for every reason, which is every time you see a cop, more often than not, they're going to harass you. They could smack you around a little bit. They caught up with him. He had a knife, a legal pocket knife. And I got news for you. When I walked around as a kid in Worcester, we carried knives because that was the fun thing to do. Look I got a pocket knife, or I got even I bought a switchblade on, mail away, 4 inches long. So what kids do. And then they beat him to the point where he died. So he was quite justified in running. Maybe if he hadn't run, they wouldn't have beat him to the point where he died. Maybe they just beat him a little bit. And we don't know the morality of those cops. To focus on the morality of those cops is also ridiculous. I don't care if that cop is a bad person. I just care that he is functioning in a capacity as a cop in a way that helps society. So Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, when nonviolence is preached as an attempt to evade the repercussions of political brutality, it betrays itself. When nonviolence begins halfway through the war, with the aggressor calling time out, it exposes itself as a ruse. He's responding to the fact that we're all witnessing the violence of those who are rioting, but we don't witness the violence that takes place in this community on a daily basis that has instigated this reaction from people. We only saw a snippet of that video. And there only is a snippet of video, as far as I know, from what happened to Freddie Gray. We don't see what's happening on a daily basis there. You know, it may just be a tremendous coincidence that rioting takes place in incredibly poor, desperate communities. That may just be a coincidence. When nonviolence is preached by the representatives of the state, while the state doles out heaps of violence to its citizens, it reveals itself to be a con. And none of this can mean that rioting or violence is correct or wise, any more than a forest fire can be correct or wise. I mean, that's the perfect metaphor. You light a flame to a forest that is a tinderbox, that is dry and has been primed to go up in flames, and it's going to go up in flames. And you can't say like, well, if that fire burns everything, all those trees down there, it's going to have nothing else to burn. It's going to burn itself out. Or why would a forest put itself in a position to be a tinderbox and so subject to a forest fire? I mean, that's just the reality of it. I mean, you can come up with a lot of different reasons. But we can actually look and see, when we see outbreaks of violence like this, it's in Ferguson or across the country. These riots don't help, but that's... Yeah, neither does gravity when you're trying to reach something that is 3 feet above your head. It's just the reality. And so the question becomes, are we going to address it?